Well, as protests continue for a ninth straight day, parents are wrestling with how to have these conversations with their children. Vlad, we often talk a lot about how to address certain issues with my own daughter, and I know you have nephews, and you discuss it with your sister as well. And I'm finding it really challenging. I chose to bring my daughter down to the Rittenhouse Square area on Sunday after the riots because I thought it would be a good teaching experience for her. But you're still trying to protect them. And I had the conversation with her this morning to see just exactly what she had grasped from the whole experience to explain why people are angry and frustrated. And after about 3 minutes, she covered her ears and walked out of the kitchen, and she just said, "I don't want to talk about it anymore." And in a way, I don't blame her, because it's an uncomfortable thing for adults to talk about amongst each other. I can't imagine what it's like for kids.
Yeah, for sure, for sure.
So we're going to help everyone deal with this conversation. We want to bring in Beverly Daniel Tatum. Beverly, you're a psychologist, and you're also the author of Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria and Other Conversations About Race. Just as a side note, I really love that title. Because it's true. So let's just dive right into it. Race is always an awkward conversation for adults to have amongst themselves. I don't know what kind of conversations are happening in houses, both white and black and other parents. But how do we even begin to tackle this problem if kids are seeing, the rioting and the peaceful protesting, but they're seeing what's happening on TV? It's kind of hard to avoid at this point.
Absolutely. And parents should talk about it with their kids. But I would start not with the protest, but what's the source of the protest? Why are you, as a mom or dad, upset about what's happened? And helping young people to understand the unfairness of what's going on and why peaceful protest is important is, I think, a good place to start the conversation. Of course, there might be questions too about some of the criminal behavior that's happening around the protest, but I would start with just the unfairness of racism and why we need to work together as a society to make it different.
So for families out there who may find these types of conversations uncomfortable, what's the danger of staying silent? Or not even uncomfortable. I think, Beverly, oftentimes it's like, when I was in high school, I remember that I had a friend who was very close to me, who was somebody who believed in equality, and she had an incident where she started dating somebody who was not of her race, and her parents had a freak out moment, and it was very, very hard for her to understand why her parents were freaking out about this, because they had always told her, you should treat everybody the same way. You shouldn't be somebody who's prejudiced against people who are not of the same race or not of the same religion. Oh, but all of a sudden, when she started dating somebody who was outside of her race, and then you saw a very different conversation with the family. So I wonder, for people who struggle to give the lessons to their children that will prevent things like that from happening, how do they go about doing that?
Well, if the family has prejudicial attitudes, that conversation is going to be a very different one. But if the family truly wants to create children who are inclusive and anti-racist in their own behavior, they have to model it. We have to walk that talk. But part of the challenge is our willingness to have these conversations. When I ask adults if they have an early memory of a race-related experience, many of them will say they remember something from grade school. But then if you ask, did you talk to anyone about it when it happened? They will say, no, I didn't talk to my parents. I didn't talk to my teacher. Even as 6 and 7-year-olds, they'd already learned that adults didn't want to have that conversation. So if we are silent, we leave our children with confusion and anxieties that they don't know how to process.
One of the challenges that I have as a parent, so I'm hoping that other people have that challenge too in raising a Black child, is it's very easy for me to figure out the language to make her feel prideful about her skin color and her hair and her cultural and ethnic diversity because there's a complex background. My challenge is also bringing up the very painful history of being African American in this country. My concern is about how she will view herself once she learns about slavery. And you tell a fascinating story about, I think your child was 4, and you can
Yes.
correct me if I'm wrong, and asked if Africa is so great, why are we here? And you gave a tremendous answer. So I want you to give us that answer, but also explain sort of the components of that answer, the elements that we can repeat in other conversations to our children.
Sure. Well, let's start by saying that that conversation started when my 4-year-old son, who was growing up in a predominantly white community, said that one of his white classmates told him he was Black. And he said to me, Mom, my skin is not Black, it's brown. And so I said, well, Black is a term that people use to describe African Americans, and you are an African American. And I talked about having pride in being African American. And then I was going on about, the wonders of Africa, at which he said, if Africa is so great, what are we doing here? And that, from a 4-year-old's point of view, and from my point of view, could only be answered honestly by saying a little bit about the history of slavery. Why are we here? Well, we're here because Africans were brought to this country as workers, as slaves. And so I talked a little bit about that in a 4-year-old way. But one of the things that I wanted to be very clear was that this was a long time ago, that I was not a slave, he was not a slave, his grandparents had never been slaves, that it was a long time ago, but it was also very unfair to bring people against their will, force them to work, not pay them. But it was also important for him to understand that people worked against that unfairness, not just white abolitionists, but also the enslaved people themselves struggled to break free, and many of them were able to escape. I wanted him to know that they had been empowered enough to try to take care of their own freedom, but also that there were allies, that we need children to understand that there have always been white people committed to social justice, and that together they were able to eliminate slavery. That was a story that in a 4-year-old's mind made sense to him. But he did later, a few days later, ask me more questions, and we revisited that conversation. It certainly wasn't something I was anticipating talking to him about at the age of 4, but his questions prompted that conversation. And that's often the case. Young children will ask questions, and if parents are able to listen carefully to those questions, they can answer in an age-appropriate way that gives kids real information and helps them understand better what's happening around them.
You know, Dr. Tatum, it's interesting to me, and I love this conversation. Anne-Marie and I have talked about this frequently because there's an opportunity here to have a granular discussion around race, and it's not a monolith. I mean, even when we're talking about Black people or brown people or even white people, there's no monolithic race. For example, Anne-Marie and I have talked about being mixed race and having parents and grandparents who aren't born in this country and have a different perspective about racism in America, which is very different than the racism that exists in other parts of the world, and how that can have an effect on children. Mixed race children who grow up in perhaps more, in some instances, who grow up in more privileged surroundings, who then find themselves like this birdwatcher in Central Park who went to Harvard, and he is still ultimately treated, doesn't matter where you went to school or what your pedigree says, you end up getting treated the same way. I have many, many years talked about a great book called How the Irish Became White, which talks about how Irish Americans, and even before that in the United Kingdom, were not treated as white until the post-19th century era in this country. So there's all these conversations. You actually write about that also in your book when it relates to folks who are considered quote unquote white.
Yes. Well, part of our challenge today is that so many of us don't have a good understanding of U.S. history and how racism has operated. The conversations, for example, that we're having now around immigration are very similar in the stereotypes and the ways that immigrants were described when those immigrants were coming from Eastern Europe in the early part of the 20th century, or from places like Italy, not to mention Ireland. So the fact is that there's a lot of information that informs our current moment, but many people don't know that information, which is why it's a wonderful thing that there's so many resources now available for people to educate themselves. Not only great books for adults, but also great books for children that parents and children can read together. And that's another way to have a helpful conversation by using that material, whether it's a book like there's a book for children called Something Happened in Our Town, which is particularly about a police shooting, written for kids between the ages of 4 and 8, that parents could sit and read together and talk about if they're looking for help, guidance for these conversations.
And I guess the other conversation that is happening here that is kind of that intersects with race is, of course, about the role of police.
Yes.
I'm wondering how we address that. You know, you want to raise a child to be respectful and certainly not fearful of the police, but you know, the reality of it is, because we've seen it on TV, that in some cases, you know, being fearful of the police may not be a bad thing.
Well, certainly it is the case that, on the one hand, as you said, you want children to have respect for police officers and also to know that sometimes you need a police officer. You know, you have a car accident, something bad has happened, you want the support and help of police officers. But at the same time, African American parents know that when their children are old enough to be away from them, maybe as teenagers driving a car or out on the streets of a city by themselves, they need to know that people may perceive them in ways that are not helpful. Stereotypes about young Black adolescents might be projected onto them. And knowing that means they also need to know how to respond if they are stopped by police or if they're being hassled. And if you don't have those conversations, you leave your child vulnerable to being perhaps abused, even killed by a police officer. So it is a delicate balance to both recognize that most police officers are trying hard to help other people, but some can be harmful to you, and that's a reality that we all struggle with as parents. But I think speaking honestly about it and also connecting children to the helpful people you know in your community. Maybe there are police officers in your church. Maybe there are folks that are in your family that you can say, we know there are lots of good people, just like most of those protesters are good people and not causing problems. But sometimes things go awry, people make mistakes.
Beverly Daniel Tatum, what a fascinating discussion. I got a lot out of it. I hope you did, Anne Marie, and I know our viewers did. Really, really interesting. Thank you so much for it. I love when we can have discussions like this that sort of go beyond the surface of what is in the news cycle to sort of get at some of the issues and some of the questions, concerns, challenges that people may have or they may be thinking about. And you're able to do that for us. Hopefully you'll come back and we'll continue this discussion.
Well, I welcome the opportunity. Thanks for having me.